Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Christian Mogner. I'm one of the conveners of the BA Social Theory Group, and I would like to welcome you to this BSA event. This event is dedicated to an influential sociological thinker, William Edward Burkhardt Du Bois, and is part of a series of events. So some of you might have attended some of our previous events where we want to revisit sociological thinkers from the perspective of contemporary issues and debates. In particular, the talks and conversations are going to focus on debating established narratives of great thinkers, or the so-called classic, but also relate this social thinker to contemporary issues like race, globalization, or sort of rapid social change. We hope that these discussions will demonstrate the relevance of these social thinkers and usefulness of sociological theory for sociology on the whole. And for today's event on Du Bois, I'm very pleased that we have two speakers that will present this influential social thinker. So we have Gurminder Bhambra, who is professor of postcolonial and decolonial studies in the Department of International Relations in the School of Global Studies at the University of Essex. Before joining Sussex, she was a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, and she is also a guest professor of sociology and history at the Center for Concurrences in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies at Linnaeus University. She is also a visiting professor at the EHESS in Paris, and she was a visiting fellow in the Department of Sociology at Princeton. Professor Bhambra's first monograph, Rethinking Modernity, Postcolonialism and Sociological Imagination, published by Palgrave in 2007, won the prestigious 2008 Philip Abrams Memorial Prize in Sociology. Her research on Eurocentric accounts of the emergence and development of modernity was developed further in her project on connected histories, proposing a new global historical sociology, which can be found in her second book, Connected Sociologies, published by Bloomsbury in 2014. She has been editor of a number of books in this field and is the series editor for the Theory of a Global Age series published by Manchester University Press. Professor Bhambra is also hosting the Global Social Theory website and is the convener of the Postcolonial and Decolonial Transformations Group here at the British Sociological Association. I'm also really pleased to welcome Dr. Vanessa Thompson, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Social and Cultural Sciences at the European University of Viadrina, Frankfurt Oder. So I sort of emphasize the Oder here. So if you know, that's the Frankfurt near Berlin, because she has a PhD from the Goethe University of Frankfurt am Main, which is the other Frankfurt on this western side, where she completed her doctoral dissertation called Solidarities in Anti-Black Racism, Black Urban Activism, and the Struggle Beyond Recognition in Paris, for which she conducted intensive detailed ethnographic fieldwork in Paris on Black urbanist activist groups, as well as on Black queer clubbing scene. She was a fellow at the Department of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as a visiting scholar at the Ethnic Studies Department of the University of California in Berkeley. Her research and teaching are focused on critical racism studies, postcolonial and decolonial feminist theories and methodologies, Black studies, gender and queer studies, critical security studies, as well as transformative justice. She is published in several languages, and her recent papers include topics like decolonializing city spaces and images, Black collective solidarity on conviviality in Paris. She has also published on postcolonial ethnographies, as well as Black feminism. I'm really pleased to have you two here for today's discussion. So just to outline for our audience, two speakers will engage in a discussion on Du Bois for the next 40 minutes. After these 40 minutes, we have 15 minutes for a Q&A session. Please feel free, should any part of that discussion inspire any questions, to put them into the chat room. So I will monitor the chat room and then also look after the discussion later on. Please also note that this meeting today is recorded. So whenever you unmute yourself to ask a question at the very end, please do recognize that this will be recorded and then later put on the BSA Social Theories website. Okay, so this is what is from me for today. So thank you very much to our speakers for joining us today. Gurminder, I wondered if you want to make a start and maybe tell us a bit about the context for today's session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Christian. It was really nice introduction, and it's great to be here in conversation with Vanessa about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, just to provide a little bit of background to frame the conversation that we're going to have. I mean, Du Bois was a contemporary of both Max Weber and Emile Durkheim, although he lived for such a long time that, you know, he was active beyond the period of 1890 to 1920 that often gets identified as the foundational moment of sociological theory. One of his key works, which is Black Reconstruction, was written in the 1930s, just at the time that Talcott Parsons begins to create the very idea of there being a founding generation of classical social theorists. And so his absence from that sociological canon is not because he wasn't central to the times during which the canon comes to be founded. In terms of an overall account of Du Bois's life and his relationships with both sociology and political science, there have been a number of really good books that have come out recently, one by Alden Morris, another by Robert Vitalis, and with the BSA Postcolonial and Decolonial Transformations Group, we had Jose Itzgerson and Corrida Brown talk about their recent book on Du Bois as well. Du Bois gets presented by many as an African-American pioneer of sociology to the extent that he's recognized. And I think perhaps one of the things that Vanessa and I would like to draw out through this conversation is that he's not just an African-American pioneer of sociology, he's actually a pioneer of sociology. And so what does it mean to sort of think about him as an African-American pioneer of sociology rather than a pioneer? I didn't know whether you wanted to come in at this point, Vanessa, and
Thank you so much, Christian, for the introduction, and of course for having the possibility to be in conversation with you, Gurminder. Yes, I think it's I was thinking it's so important to have this kind of conversation and to really ground Du Bois also beyond the discussion around the US and also conjunctures of racism in the US. But I was thinking maybe we just start with some words on his biography and also his background. Would you like to tell us a bit more about who Du Bois actually is and his work and activism?
Well, so Du Bois is born in 1868, and he's born in Great Barrington in the northern state of Massachusetts. This is 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which starts the process of abolishing slavery across the former Confederate states, and it's 3 years after the end of the Civil War. This is a period, his early life is lived across the period of Reconstruction, but his adult life is really lived under Jim Crow because the gains of Reconstruction, and perhaps we'll come back to his monumental book, Black Reconstruction, a little bit later in the conversation. But I did just want to give a sense of his biography because he is such an extraordinary figure. So he goes to university at Fisk, and there he has to go from the north to the south. He crosses the Mason-Dixie line, and he really gets exposed to Jim Crow in the South in quite a visceral sort of way. He has a classical liberal arts education, and he graduates in 1888. And then he goes on to continue his studies by starting a PhD at Harvard. There he's one of the first he is the first African-American to gain a PhD from that institution. And he works with the pragmatist philosopher William James, and he also spends 2 years at the University of Berlin during this period. He has a distinguished career, and it's a career that's marked by the segregated realities of the US at the time. So for example, he gets teaching jobs at what are called historically Black universities and research jobs at what I would call as historically white universities, because as an African-American, he wasn't allowed to teach white students rather. And so the work that he does, for example, at the University of Pennsylvania, he's only allowed to undertake research work, not any teaching work. he does get a little bit, I guess, disappointed or frustrated with the academic life, and then enters politics more explicitly. So he's one of the founders of the NAACP. He becomes editor of its monthly magazine Crisis. And over his life, he does everything from being a delegate to the newly established United Nations. He's involved in Pan-African congresses. He's an anti-war activist for much of his life. And he ends up by leaving the US and going to Ghana at the invitation of President Kwame Nkrumah, and spends the last years of his life in Ghana. And so his work is scholarly, it's political, it's engaged, he's an activist, and he's a scholar of the highest distinction. That's just, I could talk for a very long time about Du Bois and so on, and we will. But perhaps that's sufficient background for now. I mean, how do you use Du Bois in your work, Vanessa? How does he come into the sorts of research that you've been doing? Why is he important to you, I guess?
Yes. Well, I think studying philosophy and sociology in Germany, I never came across Du Bois. I think that's really important to state, that although he's such a crucial sociologist who has developed and delivered such an oeuvre, so to speak, I never came across him in universities, but it was rather like self-research. I actually came across Du Bois through Fanon. So I was studying Fanon and Frantz Fanon's critique of Sartre and Hegel and Marx in his conceptualization of colonial alienation. And that's where I actually did some more research and came across Du Bois' work, The Souls of Black Folk. And I was actually thrilled to hear that he studied in Berlin at the Humboldt University in 1892 to 1894. And there he was really researching and working a lot through with German philosophers, but also economists. And one can see this also in terms of how he then engaged with German idealism in his work, The Souls of Black Folk. And I was interested in his notion of double consciousness, because like looking at Fanon's colonial alienation, and I thought, well, what Du Bois actually delivers with this understanding of double consciousness, for me at that time was like more productive, because Du Bois also sees double consciousness as a form of second sight that can tell us something about how marginalized, deprived, racialized communities actually conceptualize the world, and thereby also systems of domination and exploitation. So there is this notion of lived experience in Du Bois' work as an epistemological category that was really crucial. And I think that's one of like the, I would say one of the major contributions that I tried to develop in, or like to really ground in my work, to think about knowledge production from the lived experiences as a starting point for political analysis. I think another aspect would be methods. As someone who works with ethnographic methods and qualitatively, but Du Bois also did quantitative studies, but even from the qualitative method approach, Du Bois was a crucial founder, one could say, of certain methods like participant observation or even field work in sociology. And I think that's also often written out really in a way in terms of the methodological and methods discussion, because in his work, looking like the study of the Philadelphia Negro, for example, he really also engaged with communities that were excluded from the realm of the human, so to speak. And to me, this methodological approach is also very, very important. So I think these are just two contributions which I try to work upon in my work and to depart from in my work. Another one would be the concept of abolition democracy, as I also work on policing. Yeah.
I was just wondering, because could I just pick up on some stuff around the Philadelphia Negro, and then we can move on to the issue of democracy? Because I think, in a sense, Du Bois's work is marked by these key texts in very particular sorts of ways. And the Philadelphia Negro was the first. I mean, it's now being recognized as the first sociological text to have been produced. You know, often this, within the US, often this distinction gets given to Thomas and Zanieki's The Polish Peasant, which is published in 1920. But the Philadelphia Negro, if you read it, it's a sociological study. And as you say, he does qualitative research, he does quantitative research, he engages with people, he talks to people, he sort of, he walks the streets, developing his mapping processes and so on. It is just such a rigorous investigation of a community, fundamentally organized around a sort of a sociological question about this group of people, African Americans, who live in Philadelphia, but who don't form part or are not seen by white Philadelphians to form part of what Philadelphia is. And so his study of them is just monumental in terms of the effort, the rigor, as you say, the methods, but then also the outcomes and what it is that he's presenting, because it's not just you know, so you do have the social settlement movement that's happening at that time, often led by people like, well, the Hull House group and Jane Addams and others and so on. Their studies are often more limited and they focus on specific social problems. What Du Bois is doing is an empirical sociological study that focuses on social relations as a distinctive contribution to how we come to understand society. And so I just wanted to sort of pick up on you mentioning the Philadelphia Negro to sort of point to the extent to which it's, what would we say, sort of distinctive and transformational for its moment, how so many of its insights get taken up by what later comes to be known as the Chicago School, but without any citation back to Du Bois.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's crucial. Like, I mean, he was the first sociologist, I would say, who with vigor also departed or challenged this kind of armchair theoretization in terms of studying communities. And also, I mean, he already there thinks about this notion, not people as problems, but problematization as a social and societal process, that actually people are made into problems, and I think, and are not problems themselves. And we still see that in sociological research, social sciences. I mean, then going back to until the 1960s, 70s, and I would even say today in terms of culture of poverty approaches and stuff like. And Du Bois already challenged that at this time, and that's really crucial. Gurminder, you have a book coming out, a co-authored book on colonialism and modern social theory, in which you include Du Bois as very central to the sociological canon. But we've already talked about that he was actually always excluded from that canon, still is excluded from the canon. Can you say something about like how you center Du Bois in the sociological canon, but also talk a bit about these modes of exclusion?
I mean, one of the things that I think it's so interesting when we look at Du Bois and his work is precisely, you know, as I was saying, he's active during the period that sociology is said to be established, 1890 to 1920. He continues to work after that period, and everything that he does, and it seems perhaps sort of engaging in hyperbole to sort of make such comments, but actually his work is extraordinary when you read it. And for writing this book, I went back and read a lot of Du Bois's work, and it was just interesting that the extent to which I sort of thought I knew what it was that he argued, and yet still found so much more within the texts to be able to sort of think more. And perhaps I can just pick up on his book, Black Reconstruction, because often Du Bois's work around souls of Black folk, I think, is really important and it gets picked up. But Black Reconstruction hasn't been in the same way. And in part, I guess it's because it's a work of history. So sociologists have a sense of how do we engage with this work of history. But one of the things that for me is significant about this book is that for Du Bois, it wasn't just about retelling the narrative of events that had occurred, but an attempt to situate those events as world historical in the context of the coming into being of the modern world. And so what Black Reconstruction does is head on address the academy, and the academy is largely constituted in the US, given that it's a segregated country, by white academics who argued that Reconstruction had failed. So Reconstruction is the period after the Civil War, the 10 to 15 years where African Americans were given the right to vote, had access to political participation and so on, until the Jim Crow laws were brought in to take those rights away again. And the dominant form of scholarship within the US had been to understand that period as a failure. And the argument for why it was a failure, and again, it goes back to this cultural deficit argument, was that the suffrage had been extended to African Americans too quickly and they couldn't cope with it. And because they weren't sufficient to do this, it had failed. And what Du Bois demonstrates is that actually African Americans had been actively involved in bringing about democratic government. They had established free public schools, and they had provided new social legislation that addressed poverty across all communities. So the involvement of African Americans during the period of Reconstruction had generated policies and legislation which had worked to the benefit of all poor and impoverished communities. When Jim Crow came in, it undid, well, when Jim Crow came in, it kept all the gains that African Americans had fought for, except the aspect of African American suffrage. So in many cases, all the changes that had been made to the constitutions, all the work that had been put in to establishing social assistance programs and so on for all communities, they continued for white communities after the start of Jim Crow, and African Americans were disenfranchised. And so this was, in a sense, the political claim of Black Reconstruction. And what he did through the book was reclaim the figure of the emancipated slave as a central actor. So again, there's this idea that emancipation was something that the North gave to enslaved peoples. And Du Bois challenges this problematic claim by saying that people had actually taken their freedom for themselves. He called it a general strike, because what people had done was effectively stop laboring on the plantations, down their tools, and migrate north. And that for him was a general strike. So he sees it as an economic demand, an economic act, and an economic act which also brings about political emancipation. And so there was a very strong, and he has almost a spiritual sort of argument in there at one point, because he talks about this as the coming of the Lord, that it was the fulfillment of prophecy and legend. And so in a book that's very historical sociological, again, it's full of detail, it's rigorous, it's methodical and so on. And then there's a small interlude, and Robbie Shilliam has written about this a bit as well, where he talks about emancipation in quite spiritual terms. And so it's an interesting, it's interesting to think about what that means in the context of the book as a whole. Can I just say one more thing? Sorry, I know probably, it's just that, you know, in the context of debates that are happening at the moment about how history is written and, you know, who gets to tell history and so on, and his argument, and he writes this in the conclusion to Black Reconstruction, is that what he wanted to do with the book was for it to stand as a contribution to a more adequate history of the period. And it was an attempt, in his words, to establish truth on which right in the future may be built. So this idea that the problematic accounts of Reconstruction of the past hadn't allowed for there to be a politics that enabled people to work together to construct democracy. And by telling the story truthfully, that opened up the possibility of constructing a different sort of politics in the present. He was to be disappointed, of course, but that was his ambition for the book. Have you read Black Reconstruction? Do you use it yourself in ways, or?
Yes, I mean, it's really, yeah, I do. Specifically his concept of abolition democracy, because I think Du Bois is also, he powerfully shows that through the formal abolition of enslavement, that through formal abolition, actually, that doesn't mean that the logics or systems that made enslavement and colonialism possible in the first place are actually abolished. And I think that's also, particularly now in this kind of conjuncture of Black protests and rebellion, where a lot is about carceral institutions, policing, prisons, etc. Of course, abolition democracy is such an important framework because it puts forward that actually what he calls abolition democracy requires a complete new construction of institutions, social relations, economic relations, etc. And I think that's really also something that we can, in a way, learn from Du Bois, that like the formal, even with the formal end, for example, of colonialism, because he was also very, very engaged, specifically also towards that time, like the 1930s, because he started also to become more internationalist and more radical, so to speak, also in materialist, and also was drawn more to Marxism in that during that that time period. That I think it, yeah, the Black Reconstruction, I think, is really such a powerful also work in the Black radical tradition, by starting to approach and think history also from the perspectives, but also the struggles of, in his case, then in the Black Reconstruction, the Black enslaved, and what's actually the contribution, but also the radical transformation that was embedded in these struggles, and what is still to do. And I think that's where the concept of abolition democracy is so important, or that's where I often turn to Black Reconstruction in terms of engaging with this concept. And I also think that it's interesting because I try to think of Du Bois' work, which is, I mean, he's written so much, also together in a way, because like, whereas in The Souls of Black Folks, where he has asked a question around like, how does it feel to be a problem? And he rather looks at the effects and experiences of racism. I think the later work, so to speak, or what he writes specifically in the 1930s and also 1940s, also links this kind of lived experience of oppression and exploitation through larger historical formations and, of course, political economies. And that's where I think it's also important to really understand Du Bois as a very crucial thinker and theorist of racial capitalism, in terms of that one cannot separate racialization from foundations of capitalism, but also, of course, capitalist exploitation and accumulation, and to, yeah, and to really think these kinds of theoretizations around lived experience, situated knowledges. I mean, I would also say Du Bois actually was really pushing towards, or developing, a notion of what we later will learn about was standpoint theory, so to speak, and linking this to political economies and to an analysis of racial capitalism. I think he's a crucial figure, and that's also, I think, something we can engage with, and which is even contemporarily deeply and very important.
And I'd really like to sort of pick up that point, but I was thinking, because you've also discussed in other contexts his work on the Warsaw Ghetto, in which he's making the link between different minority groups and thinking about this, because I think partly because of his longevity, there's a tendency almost to focus very much on the early Du Bois, and yet there's also so much in his later work that in a way almost transforms him in the way in which we might think of him, because people don't straightforwardly think of him as a materialist thinker, or then somebody who's also making links with minority struggles within Europe in particular ways. I didn't know if you wanted to maybe say something on that.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I don't know if it's out yet, but Cherise Burden-Stelly and Gerald Horne, they're working on a revision of the Du Bois biography by concentrating actually on his last phase, so to speak, also in terms of his radicalism. And I think what's really crucial is during these periods, he really fleshed out more the operations of racial capitalism, but also his analysis of racism itself. I mean, I think that's really important because Du Bois before thought about, I mean, there's this famous phrase in a way, the problem of the 20th century is going to be the problem of the color line. And the so-called race question or the Black question was crucial for his thinking. And it was after his visit in the Warsaw Ghetto, so he visited Europe many times, but in 1949, he went to Warsaw to visit, so to speak, the site where Jews were revolting against their deportation to the Treblinka death camp during National Socialism. And after this visit, he wrote a short piece called The Negro in the Warsaw Ghetto. And there he revises his thinking about race, not just being a phenomenon of color. And I think that's very important because he, first of all, draws again on the experiences of Polish people in terms of German domination of Polish people, and starts to understand this as a race problem. And then also engaging, of course, with the Shoah and the Holocaust to say, like, okay, and the piece is really great because you can see how he revises the question and puts what he calls the Negro question into relation to the Jewish question by also saying, like, okay, I always approached racism as a color phenomenon, as something he called the color line, and now saying, well, it's actually not only about color, and it's a global phenomenon. And I think also in terms of these whole discussions and important debates around racism, particularly with regard to the European context, to think of racism more than just the color phenomenon is really already, I would say, in a way, also starts with Du Bois.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really, I mean, and that's one of the things that I found most interesting in going back to Du Bois's work, because, you know, as you were saying, even though he presents the color line as the defining issue for humanity, that's in The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. By the post-war period, in his book Color and Democracy, Du Bois is suggesting that the abolition of colonialism should be considered the most profound issue that needs address. And so there's a development that one can trace in Du Bois's work, and I'm perhaps being a bit controversial in saying this, and that whilst I think obviously Du Bois is fundamentally important for how we think about issues of race in the context of the US, what his later work gives us the resources to work with is, well, I would say that I would reconceptualize Du Bois as an anti-colonial thinker, that for me, his most fundamental insights and contributions are towards a rethinking of colonial global economy and the way in which race is something that's produced out of the inequalities that have been produced by colonialism. And so precisely because of that shift in analysis, I think he can see that what's happening in Europe is not anything straightforwardly distinct from what happens in the rest of the world, but it has to be understood within the same sort of frame.
Could you speak more about, Gurminder, his notion of anti-colonial solidarity, also from like a global framework?
I mean, it's something that he really develops after 45, or, you know, during the 40s. So again, he's worked in US universities, he works for the NAACP, he goes back to another university. He then goes back to the NAACP, and then he starts being much more active during this period in global events. So he's involved in the Pan-African Congresses, he's a delegate to the United Nations, he travels to India, he travels to the Soviet Union, he travels to all these places, and China as well, I think, you know, after the revolution, and he's sort of thinking about what's going on. And he comes to an understanding where he argues that issues of race have to be understood in terms of the global division of labor that's been organized through colonialism. And one of the things that I find incredible about the way in which he intervenes, so there's a conference that goes on, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, which is where the UN comes to be sort of formally established. And you know, it's largely organized between Great Britain, Russia, the United States. This is seen to be the Security Council. China's only involved in later discussions. Du Bois sees that as really problematic, given that, you know, that Asia is not included within it. And he also criticizes the fact that even though the United Nations is being set up to speak in the name of everybody, because it won't recognize colonialism as a problem and allows European nations to continue to have their colonies, then effectively that means that 750 million people who are owned by white nations don't have a voice in this organization that is otherwise being presented as the voice of the world. And so he has a very strong critique about that, and also is critical of the fact that the United Nations, to the extent that it allows a discussion on the future of the colonies and the treatment of colonial peoples, this all occurs under the authority of Britain and France and the US, who are the direct beneficiaries of the inequalities that are being contested. And so he's sort of saying, you know, how can this organization not seek to address the serious injustices of the colonial system and modern imperialism? And so by the 40s, he's sort of really developed his analysis, which brings together the disenfranchisement of African Americans, the colonization of India, and the partition of Africa into a single frame. And that's something that I think we don't know enough of in terms of the way in which Du Bois is developing his ideas. I think we're moving to the end of the sort of time of us talking. We can open up for sort of questions and discussion, but I just wondered whether you had any sort of final thing you wanted to say in relation to Du Bois, Vanessa.
I think what we can really learn from Du Bois is this connection between scholarship, public education. Also, like you said, he did a lot of journalism, publishing in public newspapers, and political activism. And his political activism was deeply international and internationalist, so to speak. And I think that's something, because sometimes there are even discussions around like, okay, what's, I don't know, public sociology. Du Bois was a public sociologist, so to speak. He really brought this together. And I think that's very inspiring and something we can definitely learn from.
Okay, super. Thank you, Gurminder. Thank you, Vanessa. I mean, this has been a really inspiring and thought-provoking discussion. So I would like to open the floor to our audience. So you can either sort of, unmute yourself and ask any questions, or sort of, if you prefer, you can also simply put your question into the chat room, and then I will read the question to our two speakers. Please do note, as I said at the very beginning, in case you've joined a bit later on, this session is going to be recorded. So in case of your picture sort of, is being recorded, then you automatically agree sort of, that we're able to do that. So are there any questions for Vanessa or Gurminder?
Someone has to be brave and go first.
I mean, if someone is not brave enough, I mean, I've penciled down like about 15 questions. So otherwise, sort of, I make a head start. Yeah, so while people sort of, maybe sort of, organizing their thoughts, sort of, and putting, formulating questions. I've got, I mean, so when listening to your conversation, it was really sort of in a way like inspiring to see how Du Bois sort of, changed his own perspective, from often sort of, portrayed as someone who works, solely on racism in terms of the color line. He moved on to something, much more global and sort of, much sort of, broader. And I've kind of, wondered sort of, when you think about also, the methods that he used, the walking, right? Something that you see a lot in urban geography, walking the city as like a method. So, I mean, he ticks in a way like all the boxes to be like, the so-called great sociologist or so-called great classic. But, as Vanessa said at the very beginning, he still isn't part of the curriculum. So I kind of wondered, so if you can speculate a bit for us on this topic, why sort of, Du Bois is someone who is still missing sort of, from these narratives of great sociologists, sort of, what's the issue sort of, with sociological theory that he is sort of, not in there, because, according to what you've said, he definitely should be.
Well, I mean, where does one start with this? He grew up in a segregated society. That segregation organized not just the segregation of people, but also the segregation of ideas. And we fail to the extent that we refuse to undo that segregation. And that segregation isn't undone simply by including Du Bois in the canon, but we also have to ask the question of what is it that we thought we valued out of a segregated sociology that we now need to rethink if we recognize that that segregation is fundamental to the development of what we thought had been good, and yet it had excluded what we think is extraordinary. So to bring Du Bois in would require us to reconfigure sociology itself. So I think one of the reasons why Du Bois doesn't get brought into the canon and into sociology is because of the amount of work that it would take to have to rethink sociology. Because he doesn't just prefigure the Chicago School, he actually has insights that are beyond what the Chicago School is ever able to develop. So it's not that he was just a forerunner and got missed out. No, actually, if we started with Du Bois, sociology would be a stronger discipline in so many ways. And he would give us the resources to think more effectively about the world within which we live, how we've got here, and what we might need to do to go beyond that. But why I would really just like to read you out, his, if anybody here likes biographies, the 2-volume biography of Du Bois by Levering Lewis is really brilliant. It's really compelling. It's a good read, and it's sort of very pacey. So, and at the end of the book, Levering Lewis sort of says, Du Bois had attempted virtually every possible solution to the problem of 20th century racism: scholarship, propaganda, integration, cultural and economic separatism, politics, international communism, expatriation, third world solidarity. So he tried everything, and still we don't acknowledge him. So what is that about? I mean, that's for those who don't acknowledge him to answer, I think. Oh, you're muted, Christian.
Thank you. It always happens. Thank you, Gurminder, for answering your questions. So we have now quite a few more sort of, questions being asked in the chat. So let me sort of, read them out to all of you and go sort of, one by one. So we have the first question by Sumin Ko, who's asking, what do you think Du Bois would think about where we are now? So how would he assess in a way like our current situation?
Vanessa, do
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think in terms of where we are now, I mean, in terms of like the conjuncture of racial capitalism that Du Bois was also interested in, and of course the kind of resistance, but also the kind of transnational solidarity, is that to continue also this work, I think he would urge us also to do this, because we currently see, specifically with the corona crisis, which is rather an effect than the cause of the problems we're actually dealing with currently, and that we see it in terms of global health stratification, in terms of who's dying, in terms of the biopolitical and necropolitical dimensions of this crisis, and how they're actually just embedded in the conjuncture of global systems of racialized and gendered inequality and exploitation. I think he would maybe also, again, urge us to think about that, how important abolition democracy is, that it's really just because we have certain formal equality rights or whatever, that doesn't mean a system is abolished that was able to even make enslavement and colonialism possible. And that's where we still are. And what we see around us and happening to the majority of the people in the world has much to do with this. So I think, because I read Du Bois as an abolitionist too, and think that's also, something he might leave us with.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. So let me move on to the next question, also for comments. So we have one from Claire Griffith, who's saying, we're all discussing decolonializing pedagogy and research in our various disciplines. Listening to you both today, I have the impression that Du Bois was already there in 1899. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's one of the things around the way in which, there are paths that don't get taken. And if we had taken Du Bois seriously, we could possibly have been in a position where there may well have been other problems, but the erasure of Black thought and anti-colonial thinking and processes might not have been so dominant as they are at the moment. So I think, and picking up on what Vanessa was saying and the question that Su-Ming asked, I mean, if Du Bois was looking on at the moment, I think one of the things he would potentially be is disappointed at the way in which so much of the politics of our time has shifted to a politics of separation and contestation among oppressed groups, rather than a thinking through of the making of solidarities and a recognition of the colonial system that continues to be in need of deconstruction and the creation of a different political project that involves all of us. I mean, he comes to be a very, very global in his orientation through anti-colonialism. So not just global, oh yes, the world is global and therefore I should think globally. No, it's an embedded and embodied commitment to anti-colonialism that frames the way in which he thinks about these things. And so he had that already, which meant that it was possible, and obviously other people have it as well. All the thinkers who we read of as individuals, Fanon, Dada Bainoroji, Césaire, Suzanne Césaire and others, and so on, we read them as individuals. If we systematize their thinking, what would that open up as possible? So it's to sort of agree that yes, he was doing the work that I think we need to do.
All right. Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few more questions, so let me move on. So the next question is from my colleague Lisa McCormick, who's also one of the other co-conveners, and she is asking, I'm interested in your thoughts about Du Bois's idea of the talented tenth. How does this relate to the contemporary sensibilities about elitism and the socio-political aims of Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, there's been much debate and discussion around the talented tenth, and also like kind of, I don't know, being an elitist approach in Du Bois. And I think there's one could confirm that. Also, I think there's also important that Du Bois was really thinking about the responsibilities that actually come with that. And at the same time, I think maybe you need to correct me there, Gurminder, I'm not sure that he later also distanced from the talented tenth formulation. And I think how it relates to aims or struggles of Black Lives Matter is also a good question, in terms of that it cannot just be about, but I think even Black Lives Matter, it really depends on where. I think it's more a spectrum also, because it is often, or in certain contexts, really a mass movement that is about also struggling not just against prison and policing, but also in terms of labor rights, against environmental racism, trying to push for an international agenda. So I think that Black Lives Matter, yeah, I think it's Black Lives Matter. I wouldn't say Black Lives Matter pursues a talented tents approach in any way. I think it's much more grounded in grassroots. But I do think a kind of conversation around the radical international solidarity that is needed now, not only in terms of the African continent, but also when we look what is happening globally, right? The farmer strike in India, etc. I think from that perspective, much of Black Lives Matter organizing, some of it is already drawing these connections, but I think it will get stronger in terms of becoming a kind of internationalist movement and linking these kinds of struggles.
Vanessa, so if you know, like actually, so I've got another question, so if you know, in the chat room that is almost a bit like a follow-up question. So there's, I hope it's okay if I just read out the next one, which is also related to social movements. So Anish is asking here, historical anti-colonial resistances and movements are often characterized by various nationalisms. But there are many figures and movements that went beyond nationalist boundaries in their struggles for freedom. So we just discussed, Black Lives Matter in this context. And so the question is, to what extent was Du Bois sort of, one of them, and how, sort of, to what extent was he involved, in some of these, more international movements, and how, sort of, did he contribute to those?
Well, as one of the so-called fathers of Pan-Africanism, of course, here we already have a kind of deconstruction of like the nationalism that certain anti-colonial movements were actually employing. I mean, Pan-Africanism is about getting rid, it's about the unification of African people on the continent, but also in the diaspora. And Du Bois was a very crucial figure in all 5 Pan-African Congresses, specifically the latest one, the 5th one, which was shortly after the end of the Second World War, also showing, okay, Europe is talking about liberation and emancipation, but actually, like Gurminder said, 7 million people are under imperial or colonial rule, so they cannot talk about emancipation or liberation, or this struggle is still going on. And he was a crucial figure in this. So I think that the notion of internationalism is stronger in terms of Du Bois politics than a kind of anti-colonial nationalism. And yeah, but I think maybe you want to add something on this, Gurminder.
I mean, I can say, so again, it's complex because he shifts and changes over different times. So in the First World War, for example, he was a supporter of African Americans joining the US Army and fighting within that war. And it's only later in the 30s that he comes to think that actually that had been a wrong thing to do. But at the time, excuse me, he had done it because he thought that if African Americans fought in the war, then that would prove that they were citizens and that citizenship would then be forthcoming. And then when nothing changed, it then caused him to sort of rethink that. So he has this argument about how, in fighting for the US, African Americans die once as Americans and die twice as African Americans, and so on. So I think his understanding with of nationalism is partly that he also, and I think, in a way, why should he not, in a way, wish to assert himself as an American? And he wished that assertion of himself as an American didn't have to be by assimilating to white America, but by being recognized as an American through being an African American. And he's one of the first to really push that sort of sense that the very category of who an American is should be expanded to be inclusive of him, as opposed to him having to shift to fit that category. One of the key areas that Du Bois is much less forthcoming on is the situation of Indigenous peoples in the US. So in his presentation and in his commitment to the idea of America or the idea of the US, there's much less reflection on how the US itself is a settler colonial state. So in a sense, if anybody's sort of asking about a critique of Du Bois, I think that's one of the points that could be talked about.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think, Gurminder, so, when reading, so, the next question, so, in the chat, it's kind of like, going in that direction. So here, Andrew Jameson is asking, how did Du Bois relate the color line within the USA and the color line internationally? So did you think the US, as you said, so, almost, played part in enforcing and creating and even sort of, exporting this?
I mean, it's really interesting because he initially thinks that the problems of race in America will be addressed by focusing on the address of race relations, that those inequalities will be addressed. And then he comes to understand that the problems of racial inequality in the US will only be resolved once the problems of the colonial world have been resolved. So whilst he initially has a very strong focus on race, as opposed to thinking about socioeconomic inequality, that shifts over the 20th century to an understanding that globally produced inequality through colonialism is what needs to be the priority for any address of local color lines to be undone. And so I think that that's something that for me would also be a really strong lesson that we would need to take from Du Bois.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, we've got quite a few more. So I think, so, I'm looking at my watch. So, we've got potentially, so, 2 more questions that we can answer. So let me read. The next one is from Epidemia. So, she's asking, Du Bois identified that the relative condition of the white worker vis-a-vis the black worker was a concern and remained after emancipation. We see similar concerns in discussions about the left behind the traditional working class or versus ordinary working class. And another of his relevance today, so, the class and race nexus. So I think, would you like, so, to respond to this comment?
Yeah, maybe very briefly. I think that's a very important point, and I would agree much in terms of like focus on the then white working class and completely then reinscribing. I mean, you also make that point, Gurminder, in one of your articles, how this is a kind of white methodological move to just think about the working class in terms of the white working class and completely excluding how class relations and particularly exploitation, economic exploitation, is racialized. And I think Du Bois specifically in his later work makes this really clear. And I think another important point, and that's also in Black Reconstruction, is that he also tries to understand why it is so difficult for the white working class to really align with the Black and brown working class. And that's where he briefly talks about the white wage. And I think that's also very important approach that works, as I think, better than a kind of debate around privileges, because it is a rather socio-psychological conception to think about. Okay, there's a notion of like a non-monetary wage that is given to even the white working class, distinguishing themselves then from Black and brown working class. And I think that's also something one can work with in terms of trying to work towards rather solidarity, multiracial solidarity in terms of working class solidarity, instead of struggling around this race-class nexus in a way. And of course, we see a lot of this kind of solidarity building also in the Black radical tradition. If we think, for instance, of several programs of the Black Panthers, the so-called Rainbow Coalition, which was also a coalition between white workers, Black workers, but also brown folks, Latinx workers in the US. I think there are many examples, and Du Bois himself also, in terms of the kind of politics he was engaged in, specifically also in his later life, are important to think about these kinds of notions of solidarity. And maybe one I was also thinking about, because what I find interesting also is, and I just want to bring her name in, because I do also think that specifically his second wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, has a lot to do with Du Bois also turning more towards these international and materialist politics and questions towards the end. I mean, she was a member of the Communist Party when they met, like since the 1940s, and they married, I think, in 1950s or something like that. So it's also interesting to see actually how his politics shift in terms of the, I don't know, Black radical women also around him.
Okay, excellent. Vanessa, Gurminder, this has been a real pleasure. I mean, very sort of an interesting conversation. We had some really good comments in the comment section. So, just before we close, I just would like to make our audience aware that we have this is going to be the last of our conversations that we're going to have in this academic year. But we are planning to resume similar conversations back in the autumn in in this year. There's also we are working currently on a session actually where we want to team up with Gurminder and her BSA group, and maybe organize a social theory session over the summer. So also please do stay tuned for that. And my colleague Lisa McCormick is at the moment working on a number of early career events in collaboration with the Bauman Institute. So there will be more activities coming over the summer. I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, like asking all your interesting questions and positive comments. Like I said, this session is going to be recorded, and as soon as it's up on the BSA social theory group website, I will we will Twitter about it and let you know via our email list server. So thanks so much for coming today. It was a pleasure having you all here.